Hello, Kote Couture. Hello, my name is Annette Mills. Welcome to our webinar. Nidhi and I will be presenting on the topic of profiling and AI-driven decision-making and the privacy concerns of individuals. In this study that we're going to be presenting, we provide some insights into a study into New Zealand's privacy concerns as far as digital profiling and AI-driven decision-making is concerned. Now, as I said, my name is Annette Mills. I'm a professor at the University of Canterbury. I'll ask my co-presenter, Nidhi, to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nidhi Tewari, and I'm the Regulatory Compliance Manager at BDO in New Zealand.
Okay, thank you, Nidhi. So in this presentation, we're going to address questions such as what are the key privacy concerns that are raised by digital profiling and AI-driven decision-making, and what are some of the protective actions that people would take if they can to reduce some of their privacy concerns. And of course, we'll also talk about what organizations and authorities can do to try and mitigate some of those concerns. In this study, we're going to provide some nuanced insights into some of the privacy concerns in the context of digital profiling and AI decision-making. So as we look at the news, we see more and more that there are a lot of instances in which AI, automated decision-making, is being used to support decisions in various organizations. It could be suggesting products, perhaps the next movie that you should watch, or it could be decisions that can have more serious impacts on an individual, such as, for example, prioritizing a wait list in a hospital, or even determining whether you even get onto that wait list, identifying at-risk children, determining whether you can get a loan, determining whether you get the job that you apply for, or perhaps even see the advert for that job. So much of our lives past and going forward as technology advances will be affected by algorithms. In preparation, there are a number of different initiatives, and you can see from some of these snapshots, for example, New Zealand has been taking steps with the algorithm charter to try and address some of the concerns, to try and address things and to ensure, for example, that we have transparency, we have responsible and ethical use of algorithms, automated decision-making, accountability, but we can ask, does this go far enough? Unlike the European Union, GDPR, we do not have certain provisions in our legislation around automated decision-making. We could ask the question, do we need it? Or do we have enough? Let's see. In this session, we don't necessarily answer these questions, but we certainly want to raise awareness and to engender discussion. So that takes us to our agenda for today. So we will be looking at digital profiling. We'll talk very briefly about what it is and automated decision-making. We will look at some of the issues that emerge, what is being done. We will also talk about privacy protective mechanisms. What is it that individuals expect? We will look at our study. Our study uses a scenario based on banking. We'll discuss that a little bit more. And then, of course, we will talk about what are some of the expectations of individuals, what can we do better, and we will end with some suggestions. So profiling and automated decision-making. So we said that New Zealand doesn't have any specific provisions for this in the Privacy Act. So we've turned to the UK GDPR for some definitions. So profiling looks at different aspects of a person's personality, behavior, interests, habits, and the main purpose is to be able to make predictions or decisions about them. So we have here a definition from the UK GDPR, which defines profiling as any form of automated processing of personal data. It includes, this can include factual information about an individual. It could include inferences, anything that concerns or is related to a natural person. And that can be evaluated so that we can make decisions or understand things about the person, such as their performance at work, their economic situation, perhaps predictions about health, their interests, and so on. So digital profiles, we have different profiles as we go through life. We will have, for example, a health profile that is shared with the hospital, with our doctor. We have financial profiles. We have social profiles. We have relationship profiles. So in essence, we could see a profile as being a sort of snapshot about who we are within a particular context. And within that context, we would have certain information that comes together to create or form that profile or that picture of who we are. The aim of profiling is to understand and evaluate different aspects of a profile, which could include, as we said before, things like performance, risk beliefs, making decisions based on those profiles. So this then leads us to talking about automated decision making. So automated decision making is specifically where we are looking at decisions that are made by automated means. And as technology advances, a lot of this will be done by artificial intelligence without human involvement, or there may be minimal human involvement. These decisions are often based on the profiles that are created, which includes factual data or inferred data, and opinions, and so on. So automated decision-making can involve profiling, but it does not have to involve profiling. We also thought it was very important for us to also look at the definition of personal data, pointing out that it's not necessarily restricted to factual information about an individual. It can include opinions, it can include inferences, it can be information that is collected directly from an individual or indirectly. As long as that information relates to that individual, whether it's factual or not, it can be included in a profile. It can be part of the automated decision-making process. So it is important for us to understand what is personal information, what is a digital profile, and also to understand what takes place when we are making decisions using automated means. Often what we find, however, is that people don't necessarily always understand what is in their profile and how this affects them. So this then leads us to looking at some of the issues that this may raise. So I'll pass over to Nidhi.
Thank you, Annette. So I will first be dealing with the core issues which emerge when digital profiles are created and used. So the first and foremost issue is about the loss of control and ownership over the profile. So information which goes into a digital profile is not necessarily coming only from the concerned individual. It comes from different other sources. So that information, when put together, forms a profile. And even though the individual might not be providing all the information themselves, but because it's about them, they are associated with that information. Additionally, if that profile is subsequently used for any decision making, the outcomes or the consequences affect that particular individual. Another thing which is of quite importance is the ownership of the data as well as the profile. So if the information is coming from other sources, is the individual concerned the owner of that data? And if an organization is creating a profile based upon the data, whether the individual is the owner of that profile, these are some of the issues and concerns which are to be addressed. Now, because there is a lack of control and lack of ownership, individuals often feel disassociated from their own digital profiles, and that can be quite concerning. The second issue in relation to digital profiles is that they are quite dynamic in nature. And that's because of two main reasons. One is that the individuals themselves or any other parties, they are in a constant process of adding, removing, or modifying the information which goes into the digital profile. And second is that there are patterns and inferences which the organizations which are in possession of that profile can create and add back to that digital profile. For example, if I go to a shopping site and I add my details, that's the information which I provide. And then through my customer information or through my purchase habits, the shopping website is able to create a pattern of my consumer behavior, and that gets added back to my profile. So these profiles are constantly changing and evolving. The third issue which comes out is profiling in itself. So um, profiling or drawing on inferences and creating data is probably not accurate all the time. Um, and this can lead to undesirable consequences such as discrimination and uncovering of undisclosed information, or perhaps information which the individual did not want to share. Some of the foreseeable issues include potential for discrimination, which is the main one, when using and especially using non-sensitive data, and then the use of the sensitive data which emerges from drawing of patterns. Um, Next, I will be talking about the issues which emerge from AI-driven decision making itself. The first is about consent. Um, Now, when data is usually collected, consent is taken from the individual at that point, and it could be an express consent or implied consent, but we assume that there is some sort of consent. But there can also be data which is collected from the individual without their knowledge or without their consent, for example, from a third party source. And all of that, it gets added to profiles which are subsequently used for decision making. Another issue in relation to consent is that while some of the jurisdictions do have a consent mechanism when individuals' information is used for automated decision making, a lot of jurisdictions do not. For example, New Zealand does not really have a provision where people have to give consent if their data is used for automated decision making. The second is reasonability of use. As we understand that when we collect data, we have to use it for some specific purposes. But when it gets fed into an AI-driven system, which lacks some sort of transparency, then what is the reasonability of use there, and when does it become unreasonable? These are some of the questions which can lead to issues. Next, we have the generation of information through inferences. Now, just as I mentioned that for profiling, it becomes an issue. Similarly, for AI-driven decision-making, inferences are also an issue. The inferences may be incorrect. They may uncover data which may not be, which the individual might not want to share. It can uncover sensitive information from non-sensitive information which has been provided. The next, which and the most important one probably is errors. Errors in the processing of data or errors in the input data itself. In both the cases, the output could be erroneous, and the erroneous output could affect the people about whom the decision is being made. There are also issues about the ownership of the data, which is generated through an automated decision-making system. So if there's a decision about an individual, do we qualify that as a personal decision, personal information, and does the individual have ownership over that? Or does the organization which owns the decision-making system, they have the ownership over that? And finally, this is something which has already been noted, that when AI-driven systems or automated decision-making systems are implemented and the training data set is biased, or the people who have operated on training the decision-making system, they have been biased. The decision-making systems have also been biased towards certain communities because they pick up that bias from the training.
Thank you, Nidhi.
Thank you.
So what is being done in New Zealand? What do we have in place at the present time? So in New Zealand, there are a number of different instruments that help with dealing with some of the issues that have been raised around profiling and automated decision-making. So one of the key ones is the Algorithm Charter for Aotearoa New Zealand, and we'll come back to this one. There are various other human rights instruments within New Zealand. We have the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, Human Rights Act, and of course the Te Mano Rarunga's Principles of Maori Data Sovereignty. And then there are other instruments, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Declaration on the Rights of indigenous peoples. So there are a number of different legislations that are there to protect privacy and protect the rights of individuals. Looking at the algorithm charter specifically. Now, this piece of this document represents a commitment by a number of different agencies or government agencies within New Zealand to ensure accountability, to ensure transparency, to ensure the ethical use of algorithms in government services. And this is a very key document. So you can see here, it aims to maintain transparency by clearly letting people know of how decisions are being informed by algorithms. It's about partnership. It's about focusing on people and engaging with those who would be affected by algorithms, making sure that the data that is used, the profiles, the factual information, the inferences, that they are fit for purpose and understanding what the limitations are. And of course, a very big concern that comes up for people is bias and discrimination. So identifying and managing bias and discrimination. Ensuring privacy, ethics, and human rights are safeguarded. And very key is not to just simply have processes that are completely automated with no human input, but to ensure that there is still a human in the loop. So retaining the oversight by people in this process. This was a particularly useful and very insightful report done by the Digital Council for Aotearoa New Zealand. And they looked quite closely at automated decision-making in Aotearoa. So they spoke to over 180 people, and they looked at different situations where automated decision-making could impact the lives of people. And it's a scenario-based study. I do strongly recommend having a look at it. Some of the key things that arose from the report, apart from the details, were a number of different recommendations. And we've highlighted the first 5 recommendations here. And you'll see that all of these recommendations are around how do we manage and deal with automated decision-making in society. And so some of the recommendations included funding community groups to be able to lead their own data projects, automated decision-making projects, establishing a public sector ADM hub, working collaboratively to develop and implement private sector ADM rules, guidelines, best practices, and so on. So that is another important set of recommendations and perhaps initiatives that may arise from that. So that then takes us to looking at how does data, organizations, purposes, concerns all come together. So the starting point is individuals generate data in everything that we do, and organizations want to be able to use that data, to use the information that they can get from it to make decisions. So it could be about improving services, providing new products, many different areas. So the data comprises of, we've talked about digital profiles. So the data can come from the individuals themselves. It can come from third parties, other organizations, social media, publicly accessible information, or it could be generated by inferences. Those inferences could be based on inferences just from the data that's provided by the individual, but it could also be based on collective information that is inferred from perhaps how a group behaves. The purpose, to make decisions, okay, and we've already talked about ADM systems. The pluses and the minuses, improve services, improve sales for an organization. But of course, we have issues that could arise around things like bias, discrimination, harms, losses, and so on. So this then leads us to privacy concerns that comes up when people feel that they've lost control over how their personal information is being collected, being used, being processed, and the decisions that affect them. So formation of privacy concerns very often also comes up when we don't trust systems, when there's a discomfort with systems. So that then leads us to having a look at the study that we conducted. So this study was in 2 parts. In the first part, we conducted some interviews, and we simply spoke to 7 privacy experts and a number of individual users, and we asked them in general, what did they think about to them, what was a digital profile? What did it mean? What was privacy? What were their thoughts around automated decision making? In the second part of our study, we used what we learned from the interviews and we created a scenario that was based on the banking sector's use of personal information. Now, please note here that we created the scenario so that when we collected and we surveyed persons, they had something to think about. So it's a hypothetical scenario, but we based it around the idea that very often banks do create profiles of their customers. And they do use automated means to help with making decisions, such as determining whether or classifying a customer as being a high or a low risk, whether they're going to approve or reject a loan application. So the second part of our study looked at this scenario, and we got responses from 415 banking users. So what did we find? Well, the first thing is many of us who are probably sitting on this webinar have an idea, probably know what banks collect. But does the ordinary New Zealander know what sort of information is collected? Do we ever pause and ask ourselves why? Should they? How does it affect my profile? How does it contribute to my profile? Now, some of the examples I have on the screen are fairly obvious. We expect if we're going to sign up for a bank, they're going to ask us for name, date of birth, email address, phone number, some sort of an identifier. They'll ask about our employment. Of course, if we transact, then we expect them to collect information on payments, transaction data, when it was done, how much, location, who did we pay, who did we receive information from. When we are seeking products or we're looking at products, then we would look at things like income and expense, credit and debit cards, tax information. You might check assets if you want to borrow money for a housing loan, run credit checks, and so on. And then there's some other things that we may not always think about. So on one particular site, they had a whole category on sensitive information. And they pointed out that on rare occasions, they would also collect information related to ethnic origin, political opinion, criminal records, genetic info, health info. There's inferred data. We collect information based on transactions, and therefore we can infer things like lifestyle. We can infer things about health, about social relationships. And then, of course, there are the other things, such as when we access banking systems, whether we do them in person or on a computer or on a mobile device. We can also collect information based on, for example, the social media handle, IP addresses, location. And then there are recordings. We perhaps don't think about this. Each time we call, we have a chat over the phone, or we go into a bank, or perhaps we do something on Zoom. All of that information is being recorded and stored and can perhaps be used. So here is what we found. We interviewed our 7 privacy experts and our internet users, and we found in general, everybody felt, of course, that protection of personal information is a high priority. Anyone who says privacy is dead, no, it isn't. Okay, we all have something that we want to keep private, that we want to protect. What it probably is that privacy has to take on a different sort of nuance. But protection of personal information is a high priority. We found that people were concerned about automated decision making. They were concerned about the accuracy of the decisions, potential harms, bias, discrimination. They were concerned that they didn't have control over their personal information. Some information is collected directly from the individual. Some information is not. There are provisions in the GDPR for disclosing when information is collected from anyone other than the individual. This is something that's being looked at in New Zealand. People are concerned about retention of personal information. Are we keeping information longer than it's needed for? Nidhi pointed out errors, accuracy, transparency, accountability, data security, and perhaps not to be missed, the transfer of information to others. So here's some snapshots of what New Zealanders had to say. And I'll just pause on this slide for a minute so that you could have a look and see what it was that people were expressed concerns about. So if we look here, for example, people express concerns about accuracy right in the middle. I feel like it's really unfair if they judge me based on just viewing what there is on the internet, especially if it's dated or outdated information. Making decisions based on someone's social media profile. Automated decision making harm. People could be flagged as criminals or committing fraud based on something which may or may not be true. Right in the middle, I think it's quite unfair. I would freak out and I think I would panic. It could be one of the worst things that could happen, would be really scary. People talked about awareness. They talked about profiling. They talked about general privacy concern. One person mentioned, I received a phone call from another company and they knew everything about my background, my email inbox, also about my phone. I was shocked because I said, how can you know that about me? What else did they have to say? What did we get from this? Individuals were not as worried about the actual creation of the digital profile. However, they were more concerned about how the profiles would be used by AI systems or any sort of automated decision-making system. They were concerned about that. They were concerned about transparency, accountability, who is responsible for the decisions that are made. What if I don't agree with the decision? Is there some way in which I could contest or get some sort of intervention? And then they questioned the accuracy of the decisions that were made by AI systems. Very often we don't worry if the decision that is made in our favor. We get what we expect, or perhaps we get more than we expect. But it is a key concern to us when the decision that is made affects it. It has a significant effect, a negative effect, a harm. So when individuals are concerned about their privacy, our study told us that it creates certain expectations. There are expectations from government, from the law, and from organizations. It reduces trust. It increases discomfort. This can ultimately lead to loss of business, poor reputation, and in the eyes of others, organizations not accepting their corporate social responsibility. In the case of banks, perhaps there are some things that we can and can't do, but for other organizations, they can make decisions. So here's a snapshot from our survey. So we've included here, this is slight rewording of our questions, but you can see here on the first graph, and I've included the scales. So people felt that keeping their privacy intact was very important. For those who were answering, strongly agree, that was around 70% of respondents. So keeping my privacy intact from organizations was very important. In the middle, we asked about how familiar people were with the New Zealand Privacy Act and with the privacy policies of the banks that they transacted with. You can see that for the bank privacy policies, there was a relatively more knowledge about the privacy policies. But when it comes to the New Zealand Privacy Act, most people had little knowledge of the Privacy Act. They were not familiar with it. And then we also asked about whether people felt that using their personal information for digital profiling, AI decision making, was a good idea or a bad idea. There was a bit of split through this, but in a sense, it skewed slightly more towards it not being a very good idea. But please note here that when we asked this question, we asked it in the context of people, of banks, organizations using a digital profile for decision making, for AI driven decision making. So then what about the concerns? So again, a snapshot. I would be concerned if, and if we have a look at these graphs, we can see here that people were quite concerned. Now, when it comes to banks asking too much personal information, okay, we can see that people were quite concerned about that. collecting personal information that I did not provide. 60% answered strongly agree. We also asked about people's concerns using inferences, organizations being able to work out sensitive information that they did not provide. And again, there was a great deal of concern around that. Combining my personal information, my factual information, with information that is inferred about me. Again, most of our respondents responded strongly agree and agree. People were also concerned that bank policies may lack transparency about how personal information was used. This was around 70%, again answering strongly agree and agree. And when it comes to decisions based solely on automated decision making, more than 50% responded, I strongly agree. They were concerned in these different areas. So they were concerned about collection. They were concerned about the inferences that could be made. They were concerned about transparency. They were concerned about decisions made by automated means. So what would people do if they could? If possible, I would seek advice. Okay, around just under 50%. Strongly agree, disagree. Strongly agree, agree. So most people were in the sort of agree, somewhat agree, and agree phase. Look for alternatives. Now, remember, this is if possible, I would. Now, in the context of banks, it is an area, it's an industry in which very often we don't have a lot of choice. And so one could say, well, yes, they may want to seek alternative products, go to a different company, go to a different bank, but we all operate the same. So in some sectors, it may not make a lot of difference to the bottom line. However, for other organizations, if people can choose to do something else, then they will show their displeasure by walking with their feet. In the bottom row, we can see, if possible, I would provide fictitious information. If possible, I would provide incomplete information. If possible, I would refuse to give information that is too personal. For the banking context, you can see that most people responded strongly disagree for providing fictitious or incomplete information to the bank. That is probably because it would be very detrimental if you did that. It's not legal for us to falsify the information that we provide to a bank. However, what if it was social media, or it was some other website I was signing up for, where it doesn't really matter how many people will falsify, for example, their date of birth or something else in order to protect their privacy. So that then leads us now to looking at the protective mechanisms. So, Nidhi.
Thank you, Annette. So broadly, there are two mechanisms to protect privacy. I'm talking about just the framework, and this is separate to the privacy enhancing technologies. So the first are the legislative mechanisms. So as Annette already mentioned, the core is the Privacy Act 2020, but then there are also subordinate or other legislations. There are also codes of practices within the Privacy Act. Privacy has also been recognized as a tort in New Zealand, and there are quite a few decisions which emphasize on the right to privacy in New Zealand. And the other part are the privacy policies which are adopted by the organizations. So the Privacy Act, along with the privacy policies, they form the basic core framework of protective mechanisms in New Zealand. And in fact, in many other legislations which do have mandate for the agencies collecting information to create a policy and have their own privacy laws. So moving from the protective mechanisms, what we did was we spoke to the participants for the interviews and we asked them what kind of expectations do they have from these these bodies, basically the government and the organizations which are collecting their information. And we have condensed down the responses into these following categories. So from the government and law, the participants did recognize that there is a Privacy Act, and the Privacy Act is quite substantive. Um, they were aware about the Privacy Act, but of course, there was a bit of lack of awareness about what the actual privacy principles are. And the most important thing which came from the conversation we had with the participants was that they want the government and the law to address their privacy concerns. So not only provide a solution, which is the last point, so I will probably just talk about both of them together. They want an avenue where they can seek advice. So as Annette mentioned, that they do want to seek advice when they feel troubled about their privacy, and they want this advice generally to come from a reliable source, which is the government or the law. So they want somebody to listen to them, to address their privacy concerns, to provide them advice. And at the same time, they want an easy redressal mechanism where they can go to as an avenue if they face a breach. Even if they don't face a breach, but they feel that there is a potential that there may be an harm, there may be a harm to their privacy and their personal information. Next is that they want the government and the law to enable a suitable remedy. And by suitable remedy, there were mixed responses about what exactly would they want. Some people mentioned that they would want some sort of a compensation and the things to be restored to back to where it was. However, that might not always be possible because once the information is a part of the breach, it's out of control of anyone. But then they would certainly want to be compensated in some way. They would certainly want that if there is a threat to their identity, that is resolved. They also want accountability on part of the organizations, that if the organizations did not do enough because of which their information was not secure or because of which the breach happened, they do want the government or the law to hold them accountable. And finally, they want that there is some sort of a awareness or literacy around privacy in the country. One of the examples which was given to us was the consumer protection, that how consumer protection literacy and awareness is quite prominent in New Zealand. Consumers know about their rights. In a similar way, we would want the individuals to know about their privacy rights and to know the basic process of how they can go and enforce those rights. And similarly, we also spoke to them about what they would want the organizations to do. So the first thing is that they want the organizations to keep their personal information safe. Now, this could be done by having better protective mechanisms within the organization. Um, but the respondents do certainly feel that the organization which collects their information and stores their information must bear the responsibility of keeping that information safe. They also want that if there is a privacy breach, they should be informed about it in a timely manner. A lot of times it has been noticed that the organizations do not tell the people when there is a privacy breach, and they find out about it from the news or when the office of the privacy commissioner makes a notification, and that sets them into a panic. If the organizations have a good communication channel with the people whose information they hold, then that will create a trust with the organization also. They also want that the organizations, and not just the law, the organization also has some way in which they can approach them if they feel that their information is not safe or they feel that their privacy is under threat. And they just want some transparency and accountability on part of the organization where their concerns can be heard and some advice can be given or some assurance can be given to them from the organization's perspective. And finally, they want the organizations to take responsibility when there is a breach and to take actions and provide remedy, and actions in the form of containing the breach and by helping them with whatever is needed. So, we have seen a few big privacy breaches in Australia. We can certainly learn from them, and the organizations can develop their internal processes so that the individuals feel more trust. They feel more trust towards the organization. Um, and as a part of the interviews, we also spoke to the privacy experts to see what they have to say about how the privacy framework is being operated in New Zealand currently. So, just like the individuals, the privacy experts also agreed that there should be an increased awareness within New Zealand, and this can be done through more individual centric campaigns. Secondly, they suggested that the privacy literacy be increased in a way that from a tertiary level, from a tertiary level course outline can be introduced where students are educated about their privacy and their rights. This will also help in preventing the breaches, because if people themselves are more aware about what they should be doing and what they should not be doing, or what can be risky, then they can prevent the breach themselves. Second, they would want a dedicated grievance redressal system. So when we were speaking to the participants, we found that some participants actually did not know that they could approach the Office of the Privacy Commission. And if there was a privacy breach, they would want and go and report it to the police or any other authorities. And of course, they will not really be in a position to help them out. So a dedicated grievance redressal system can be one way to resolve this issue. They also want stricter compliance, so making organizations and the agencies which are collecting and storing the information more accountable and more responsible. And one of the things which was specifically mentioned was that fines should be increased, because currently the fines are quite moderate, and for a if it's a big agency, then for them it doesn't really make a difference. So the fines be increased. And a stronger alignment with GDPR is another thing which has been called for, so that the New Zealand law in itself is at the international level. Um, and as already Annette has discussed in the introduction, that we don't have any specific provisions currently to regulate automated decision making. It doesn't mean that there is no protection at all in New Zealand for now. Because if automated decision making leads to bias and discrimination, then protection can certainly be sought under the Human Rights Act of 1993. And it did discuss about the algorithmic charter, which provides good faith guidance. And of course, we do strive to be as strong as the EU GDPR. And finally, some of the key recommendations for the organizations. Now, this is again from our conversation with the experts. So the experts feel that the organizations should do more to improve transparency, especially when they collect, use, disclose, and retain personal information of the people they are interacting with. And this would be this can be done by doing simple things like including a privacy statement on their website, adding a contact people could go to. Next is that they should have clear processes for exercising privacy rights. So individuals who are providing their data, they have the right to access that data, request a copy of the data, and correct and update that data currently under the privacy law. And the organizations can have clear processes to deal with those requests when made by the individuals. Of course, we already discussed this one, that improved security would mean breaches are prevented and the personal information is more secure. They also expect the organizations to take responsibility and provide some compensation. This may not be monetary compensation, but compensation in a way where there is some remedy in case of a breach. And finally, the organizations to have a clear and accessible process for complaint handling. Um, Otherwise, if there's an issue, individuals often are stuck between what to do with whether to go to the organization, whether to go to the office of the privacy commissioner. And this way, if they have a clear complaint handling process, if there's a clear contact, they will know where to go. And yes, I think now we are towards the end of it, and I would request Annette to summarize it.
Thank you very much, Nidhi. So, in summary, New Zealanders have concerns. It's very clear from our study. They have concerns about digital profiling. They have concerns about automated decision making. They have concerns about AI-driven decision making. They have expectations. They have expectations of organizations that handle their information and of the government and the law to provide some sort of protective mechanisms, some remedies, and to educate, to improve literacy. Individuals will take action when they're concerned about their privacy. But also, in some cases, as we mentioned, sometimes it's difficult. Very often it's difficult for us to manage our privacy. And very often we hear people say, well, we don't really care. People don't really care about their privacy because of the actions they take. But I think we have to move past the point where we expect individuals to take full responsibility for managing their privacy, for privacy management. As we get into systems where we have increasing interconnectedness and so on, IoT, etc., it's more important that there be a much higher level sort of responsibility that is taken to protect individuals, to protect their privacy. I often say we need water to drink. We need water to survive. If the water is dirty and it's the only water that we have, we will drink it because that's what we need to survive. But it doesn't mean that we should drink dirty water. That water should be cleaned up. So coming back to privacy, we believe we can and we must take action to protect the privacy of New Zealanders. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening. We have a number of questions, so we will take those shortly. Okay, thank you for the questions that have been asked. So the first question we have here, I think it's a very good question. For every automatic decision made, do you think the system should also provide the data set used for the basis and the process of how it used the data to reach the decision? I think that's a very good question. The challenge that we have is that with machine learning, with AI-driven decision making, very often that process is not very clear. And so we're getting to the point where a lot of these processes are now being obscured and we don't necessarily have all the steps that are taken. But at the same time, organizations do need to be accountable. And so therefore, they do need to understand and be able to explain how a decision was arrived at. So internally, yes, I do strongly believe that they have to have access to the data. They have to understand the process that was used. And if this process is not fully understood, then someone needs to be able to step in and to walk through it and perhaps relook at some of those decisions that have been made. Our next question, how do people's concern about accuracy discrimination compare to discrimination that is present in a non-AI ADM context? Nidhi, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So there are concerns about accuracy, not specifically about discrimination, but there are multiple studies which are set in a non-AI or ADM context, which do show that people are extremely concerned about the accuracy of their personal information. In relation to discrimination, if there is no context and it's just about general privacy concerns, the issue of discrimination has not come up much. But in every context where there has been decision making, discrimination has been one of the prominent factors which people consider as a concern.
Mm-hmm. What I'll probably add to that as well is that when we look at non-AI ADM context, so I'm going to assume here that we mean some sort of a more of a manual type of process, or one that has, for example, a decision tree. So if this, if that, this is how we classify. Very often, those sorts of decisions may be more clear, but also they're not at the scale of what we find when we are using systems like AI, automated decision making. So I think scale is also an issue. And our systems are magnifying the bias and the discrimination within the decision making process. And so I think in some ways, we are concerned in both. But I think once we get into this technology space, that is magnified. And so therefore we need to have, it's more urgent that we have mechanisms in place to deal with that. Thank you for that question. Okay, we have here a really good example of automated decisions that can go wrong. So the Australian robo-debt scheme. So thank you for putting that one in. And if we also go and have a look at some of there's also a report on automated decision-making processes among the government sector. You can also have a look at that at some examples.
There are also some of the white papers which are available by EU, since they are looking at the AI Act now, and they have also discussed automated systems.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nidhi. Okay, do you want to have a look at the next question?
Okay, there is a difference between regulation and prevention. There is not enough emphasis on prevention, although regulation does lead into it in the long run. Banks are not incentivized to do the right thing, but are incentivized to manage their risk. Yes, we do agree with you that for now we have a regulation, but then as we discussed, that prevention is something which the individuals as well as privacy experts, they have both emphasized upon, especially when it comes to organizations which are collecting their information. They do want that there are processes in place which prevent the breach from happening, rather than just a regulation which sets some kind of compensation, or which I mean there's something negative towards the organization. Rather than that, they do want that the breach is prevented in the first place. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. And the comment went on to say as well, bias predates the internet, and banks do every day make decisions that are biased, and it is in their interest to do so. And it's not only banks. I think every organization makes decisions that are going to match with their KPIs, with what their incentives are. And some of these decisions are in our favor, and some of them are not necessarily in our favor. And so I think this is something that that goes beyond just the banking sector, the financial sector, healthcare, many different places. How do we make decisions about who gets on a waiting list and who does not? How do we make decisions about who gets access to certain resources and who does not? And the criminal system, that's another big one as well. So yes, these are issues that we do have to grapple with. Okay, the next question
would be,
yeah.
Sorry, if I can just add to that, the only difference would be that when it's a human or a person or a chain of people making the decision, there is some transparency and accountability there, and you can question that decision. But if it's an AI making that, then there is no transparency, and if there is no human intervention, you cannot question that decision. So in a context of AI, these issues become more amplified.
Mm-hmm. Yes, completely agree. So a comment here, it'd be interesting to gauge awareness of collection, particularly for marketing data gathering. Brings back to how we define privacy. It's control of our information rather than a secret. And I agree. And I think what's actually happening is that people are more concerned. They are concerned about collection, particularly when information is collected about them that's not from them. If it's collected from sources like social media, then there's heightened concern around that. However, the bigger concern is about how information is used. And perhaps as we begin to look at and redefine what privacy is, that is perhaps where we need to be focusing on. It's about use, it's about retention, it's about errors, accuracy, and so on. and not so much about the collection stage. And I guess then we can also ask about consent as well. So it's what happens a little bit further down in the chain. Yes, we've noted power. Nidhi, did you want to add to that? Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'll try and, oh, we've got a lot of questions.
Yes, there was one question which has come up again on the duration to keep data. So data retention is not just one law you can look at. So from an organization's perspective or from an individual's perspective, it will depend on two things. First would be the type of data collected, and second would be the purpose for which the data was collected. There are multiple laws and legislations which deal with different retention periods. Top of my mind would be taxation law, employment law, the Companies Act, AML Act. So there are different data retention periods which are put into it for that. And if an organization is to follow data retention, that is their own internal policy. If an individual wants to know, they can consult the legislation, or they can better consult the organization which has collected that data.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question about the interviews, whether or not we looked at the differences in perception between public and private sector data collection. No, we didn't. At this stage, we only looked at one scenario around banks, but our study can be extended into other sectors, and certainly that would be a really good place to have a look. We also thought it would be really good to look at people's perceptions with health data in the health sector versus social media versus other sorts of businesses, not just financial. Okay, someone has asked about our council has many processes in place to protect the privacy of persons. Often I struggle as a LIM officer using copies of documents provided by council and LIMs. Currently, I'm redacting documents before they are released. Is this an acceptable way to deal with private information, or should we stop giving copies of documents? I think we have to look at organizational processes. And it's a very tedious way of dealing with information, but perhaps as things become more automated, we can ask whether or not we have software that is capable of doing redaction. So in a session that I did on Monday on ChatGPT, we pointed out that there was developments in the space of a sort of privacy GPT sort of software, privacy AI software that was being put forward as a layer that would try to remove the private information before something went into ChatGPT. And so maybe that's one of the places that we have to look at, whether or not some of these processes can be somewhat automated. And I can also imagine when organizations are dealing, especially government sectors, with OIA requests, there is a great deal of redaction that needs to go on, that needs to take place. Okay, we still have a few questions and we've just got a minute left on our session. So someone asks, in industries like banking, where there's small number of players and individuals have limited ability to switch to a more private competitor, or I'd probably add to even switch, what sort of legislative protections might you like to see introduced? Nidhi, can you do that in 30 seconds?
Yes, I can try. We actually already have protection. So as you mentioned about explicit retention and sharing limitations, the Privacy Act does cover this. And then there are other legislations which apply to the banking sector, which regulate it. But at the end of the day, it is the bank's responsibility to execute and implement these. So only a legislation is not enough. It's the bank's internal processes which are to be put at par with what is expected.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry, we are not able to answer all the questions. We will soon have someone knocking at our door about concluding the session. But we would like to thank so many of you who have attended the session and for all the questions that have engendered discussion. We've included our names, contact details are there as well. We would love to continue the conversation afterwards. Thank you again, and have a great day. And Haira, thank you from Nidhi and myself.
Thank you.
Thank you.